It gives me great pleasure then to introduce today's speaker, Mani Sandweiss, who is a historian of the United States with particular interests in the history of the American West, in visual culture, and in public history. She received her BA from Harvard and a PhD in history from Yale. She began her career as a photography curator at the Amon Carter Museum in Fort Worth, Texas, and later taught American Studies and History at Amherst College for 20 years. And then she moved to Princeton, where she became professor of history. She's currently professor emerita. Mani is the author and editor of numerous books on American history and photography. Her latest publication is the one we'll be considering today, The Girl in the Middle, A Recovered History of the American West. But her previous publications include Passing Strange, A Gilded Age Tale of Love across the color line, and Print and Legend Photography and the American West, which was the winner of the Organization of American Historians Ray Allen Billington Award for the Best Book in American Frontier History, and the William P. Clemens Award. Mani is also the co-editor of the Oxford History of the American West. So I'd ask you to please give her a very warm welcome today.
Thank you all, and what an honor it is to be able to speak in this fabulous library. Could we have the other image, please? In English, as you know, there's an old expression, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, I've heard that all my life, and somehow I didn't pay sufficient attention because I just wrote a book expending 140,000 words talking about this image. So let me just begin by asking you very quickly, what do you see and what do you not see? Please just shout it out. No women? Okay, the girl in the middle. My book title gives that away. Anything else people notice? Sorry? Some military officers? Sorry? A cracked plate. You see that lightning strike hitting General Terry in the chest over there. I don't think you all have come anywhere near even 1,000 words. So let's just plunge in here. Let me explain first what you're looking at. What you're looking at is a print that was created from the original glass plate negative, which survives at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. And it's what we call a wet plate glass negative. I'll explain that in a moment. But the original is about 13 by 18 inches. So this is about the size of the original. A wet plate glass negative is the process, the most common process for making photographs in the mid to late 19th century. And just briefly, let me explain it because I want you to understand what a production it was to make this picture. A photographer would start with a sheet of window glass. They would take it inside of a dark tent that kept the light out. They would mix gun cotton and ether into a thick, viscous mixture called collodion that they would pour over the glass plate. And they would rotate the glass plate in their hand so that the collodion flowed to the edges. It was very sticky and it adhered to the glass. Then while that is still wet and tacky, it would be floated into a tray with a light-sensitive silver nitrate solution. And that would stick to the collodion, which in turn sticks to the glass. So it was like a sandwich. Then you would take that sticky glass plate, handling it carefully at the edges, put it in a plate holder, insert a dark slide, carry it out of the dark tent to where you have your camera already set up and positioned to make a view. You would insert the plate holder in the camera, remove the lens cap. This picture probably took maybe about a second long exposure, so long enough that you truly had to stand still, but not so long that you were uncomfortable. Then you reverse, put the lens cap back on, insert the dark slide, take out the plate holder, go back to the dark tent. And now you have to develop the negative before it dries, hence the wet plate negative process. If you were very, very good, and this photographer, as I'll explain, was very, very good, that process might take about 25 minutes. And basically, you had to complete the process within 30 minutes, or the negative would dry and you would no longer see an image. So I'm explaining that just so you understand that this picture is not a casual snapshot. So that's the physical object, but what are you looking at here? Who are these men? Where are they? And what are they doing? I have seen the extant prints that were made from this negative, and because of the information there, I can tell you this. This picture was made in early May 1868 at Fort Laramie, an American frontier fort along the Overland Trail in the present-day state of Wyoming. And it's made by the celebrated Civil War photographer Alexander Gardner. And it's made as part of a series of about 50 large views and about 150 smaller stereographs. Are you familiar with those double image pictures? Great, that you could view in a special viewer. Views that he made to document the work of a federal peace commission that had been sent west to persuade the Indian tribes of the Northern Plains to sign treaties that would confine them to the newly created Indian reservations that they were in the process of setting up. Now, born in Scotland, Gardner had come to the United States, or had planned to come to the United States to join a utopian colony on the American frontier. But that colony in rain-drenched Iowa did not last very long, and it had collapsed before Gardner ever sailed from Scotland, where he had been born, to the US in the late 1850s. We don't even know how Gardner became a photographer, but he ends up in New York working for the celebrated Matthew Brady, who was the great celebrity photographer of the United States and one of the two leading photographers of the Civil War. And then Gardner ends up working for Brady in Washington, D.C. and opening his own studio. He photographed America's leading political and military figures. He photographed a war-weary President Abraham Lincoln. He photographed the execution of the men who had conspired to murder Lincoln. He photographed on the killing fields of the Civil War. He was an eyewitness to America's bloodiest decade. 3 years later, to this very remote spot, 100 miles from the nearest railroad depot, Gardner is hauling his cameras, his tripods, his glass plates, his chemicals, and the sheets of window glass he would need to make these photographs. And the paper print that I've seen of this identifies these men. So let me just briefly, if I can, introduce you to them. On the far left here is General Terry. He was the man who some years later would find George Armstrong Custer and all of his men dead on the battlefield at Little Bighorn in the greatest Indian victory of the Indian Wars. Not going to use this. Next to him, second from the left, is the villain of my story. I call him my evil general. He is the evil General Harney, William S. Harney, and I'll have more to say about him. Next to him is a man some of you may recognize. Anybody recognize the man standing just to the left of the girl? Yeah, good. Yeah, General Sherman, the commander of the Union troops in the Civil War. We have an American buff out here. To the right of the girl is someone you will never have heard of. He was a Civil War general who becomes a lawyer. Second from the right is a man named Sam Tappan, who was an abolitionist and an Indian rights activist. And on the far right is the wonderfully named Christopher Columbus Augur, who commanded the military district of Washington, D.C. at the end of the American Civil War. And he's the one who guarded Lincoln's deathbed as the president lay dying. But that girl, dead center in the picture, In none of the prints that I've seen is she ever named. She is simply given a tribal identification. On the prints in Gardner's handwriting, it often says Arapaho, which is the name of one of the Northern Plains tribes. And on the negative, you can see down on the lower right, she's just called Lakota. Now, the peace commissioners and the congressmen who had appointed them had all served in the American Civil War, which had concluded 3 years before this picture was made. And each of them had confronted the challenges of integrating the recently freed slaves, the freedmen, into the American nation. And that experience led them completely wrong here. They brought the wrong toolkit of fixes west. The freedmen, they wanted schools, they wanted churches, they wanted blacksmiths, they cherished the possibility of citizenship. But what did the native people on the Northern Plains want? They wanted their land, exactly. The commissioners came west with pre-drafted treaties. It's really a misnomer to suggest that negotiations happened at these peace treaty negotiations. And of course, they prevailed. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 forced tens of thousands of Native people onto newly created reservations. And not surprisingly, those reservations quickly shrank in size. The Lakota, for example, were promised in perpetuity their sacred Black Hills. And perpetuity lasted 9 years, till the Americans discovered gold and reclaimed the land that they had just promised the natives. Now, I'm an historian who thinks about photographs and with photographs. And I take photographs seriously as primary sources. This picture has often been used to illustrate a story of an important American treaty. It's been used to illustrate a story developed from other, more conventional literary sources. But I began to wonder, what would happen if we start with this picture? If we take this picture seriously as a primary source in and of itself? And so I challenged myself to see if I could identify that girl. For an historian, this is a very odd way to start a project. I did not start out with a big question. What caused the American Civil War? What was Reconstruction? What were the politics of the Indian Wars? And even if I could learn the girl's name, even if I could answer my own tiny question, I really had no idea if it would take me anywhere. Well, the French historian Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie once said, there are two kinds of historians, parachutists and truffle hunters. He actually never explained, but I think you can infer what he meant. A parachutist looks on from high and can track people, pathogens, ideas, animals, climate, across vast stretches of land and across vast stretches of time. And a truffle hunter snuffles around in the dirt. I need to confess to you, I'm afraid of heights. Digging around in the dirt, I eventually found that the stories in this photo cover a remarkable span of American history. General Harney, second from the left there, was born in 1800, before the great explorers Lewis and Clark set out to try to cross the North American continent from east to west. The girl, I would learn, lived until 1936. So their lifetimes span American history from the second president, John Adams, to the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt. And they stand here together in a single photograph. And as they stand there, they make an important point, all the more powerful to me as I walk the streets of this wonderful city and this university. American history is so short. Now, before I get into specifics, let me talk about the general challenges of writing about a single photograph. There's, first of all, a considerable challenge in writing a narrative from an image that captures a split second of time. We tend to privilege photographs as something that give us a special unmediated glimpse of the past. But really, they rarely constitute what the French photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson called a decisive moment. I'm going to argue there is nothing decisive happening here. Photographs offer up a glimpse of a fleeting moment, but they rarely explain it. Photographs depict outcomes, but they don't show causes. And because they stop time dead still, photographs are actually at odds with history. Because what is history? History is about change over time, about how one event flows into the next, whether by chance or by design. But look at this photograph. Look at this photograph. You cannot know what happened 5 minutes before, and you cannot know what happened 5 minutes after. So in and of itself, this may be a photographic, a historical source, but it does not in and of itself constitute what we think of as history. Now, I'd also argue, though, that although photography and history are at odds with one another in so many ways, photographers and historians actually share many similarities. Both want to describe the world for others, one with a camera, one with words. Both must select the moment they want to focus on, select the characters they want to feature in their descriptions. They each must decide how to frame their subjects in space and time. But there are profound differences too. Alexander Gardner, the photographer of this image, was an eyewitness. He was there. He knew what these people smelled like. And after a few weeks in the field, he probably smelled something. He saw this world in color. He felt the springtime air. He could hear the whinnying of the horses that are in the Indian camps we can't see here. There's probably 10,000 people camped around the fort where this photograph was made. It was loud, it was smelly, it was smoky. You heard the animals. He experienced all of that. I can't know it. But I do think historians have what I call a superpower. Superpower that eyewitnesses like Gardner lack. With a little work, or a lot of work, we can figure out where these people came from, and we can see where they go after they walk out of view of Gardner's camera. We can find out what will become of them. Gardner could only capture a split second of time. So in the end, that's how I decided to structure my book. I decided to watch these people walk to this moment. I decided to watch the picture get made, and then I followed them as they walked away. Today, though, I want to keep my eye on that girl. Who is she? If you had to figure that out, where would you start to look? This is a real question. I get ideas from people. What would you look for? Other photographs that Gardner made there? Good idea. I did that, and I didn't find her in any of the others. Any other sources you would check? Yep, that's an excellent idea. Again, I went through the newspaper reports. Nobody mentions a young child floating around the negotiations like this. I went through the papers and diaries of all of these men. Nothing. I went through the official records of the Peace Commission. Nothing. I mean, I wondered in the beginning, might she be the daughter of one of the chiefs who had come in to sign a treaty, and it might be prestigious for him to have his daughter posing with the peace commissioners. Found no trace of that. I wondered if she might be a translator, a very young translator. There were many reasons that children on the Northern Plains would have been multilingual at this moment. But I found the identities of the translators, and none of them were young girls. None of them were women. But finally, in a stroke of incredible luck, In the archives of the Fort Laramie National Historic Site, which is a site now run by the U.S. National Park Service, I found a scribbled note card left in 1978 by a man named Eddie Ryan. And he had seen a copy of this photograph there, and he wanted to leave a note. He said, "I know who that girl is. It's my grandma. And her name is Sophie Mousseau." Now, Mr. Ryan was no longer alive by the time I found this note card, and he was what we historians tend to call an unreliable narrator. He also claimed to be a direct descendant of Marie Antoinette, and I just don't think so. But I could quickly see that Mr. Ryan had been 30 years old when the woman he identified as his grandmother died, so it was plausible that he could have recognized a photograph of her as a young child. Well, Mousseau, I quickly learned, is a popular name in Pine Ridge, the Oglala Lakota Reservation in present-day South Dakota. So I placed an announcement in the reservation newspaper, the Lakota Times. I sent them a copy of this image and said, "I believe the girl in the middle may be Sophie Mousseau. I would love to hear from her descendants." And I did. I've now been in touch with 4 descendants from Sophie's very large and complicated family. They have a few fading stories, but they have no other photographs of her. So they want this to be her as much, of course, as I want this to be her. My research has given them a face to go with their stories. And I have shared with them in what I think is really the only ethical way to do this sort of research, everything I find. When I go to the National Archives and find documents, I copy them and send them copies. When I write a chapter about their great-grandmother, I send them my drafts. So I want to be clear, I may have recovered Sophie's story, but I don't ever imagine that I own it. Now, to understand whether it even matters whether we know the child's name, we might ask this. How might we think about this photograph if we don't know who she is? If we treat her, as many people I've encountered do, as a symbol. Certainly, her mere presence reminds us of the power inequities that existed everywhere in American, or for that matter, British life in the mid-19th century. She's a girl, they are men. She's young, they're old. They're white, she's dark complected. But as a historian, I don't like to deal in symbols. I do not know what the photographer was thinking. I want facts. I think it's just too easy to accept this photograph as a kind of metaphor for the child's lack of power. And without offering too much of a spoiler alert, I did learn that her father's brother became the premier of Quebec. So she's not without her own connections to power, even if she likely never ever knew that. Without knowing the child's name, we might also note that her presence spurs us to think about these men's private lives. Their military careers, their political careers are public. But what happens, what do we learn if we follow them home? Because they are husbands, they are fathers, they are sons, they are brothers. Where are they eating with? Who are they sleeping with? Who are they fighting with? When you follow them home, you discover that Harney, second from the left, about 35 years before this picture was made, brutally whipped to death a young enslaved mother in his own household. And he quite literally not only got away with murder, but spent the next 3 decades rising up through the American military ranks. We learned that Colonel Tappan, second from the right, adopted a child who was orphaned in the horrible violence and the Indian massacre at Sand Creek in 1864 in Colorado, and raised that girl as a spiritualist, that is, as someone who could hear the voices of the dead speaking through her. I don't need to know the identity of the girl in the middle to find those sorts of stories. I just have to go home with those men. but knowing her name changes everything. Because names are what link people to the archives. Names are how we find them. And in the end, it's ironic, this little girl left no writing behind, but we can learn more about her than we can about the vast majority of people, native or white, born on the Northern Plains in the mid-19th century. A name is what allows us to transform young Sophie Mousseau from a seeming symbol of powerlessness into a particular person with a rich and complicated history of her own. Now, how can we know so much about her if she left no writings behind? Number one, her father lived a really long time, and he became one of those old timers that journalists would seek out to hear stories about the old days. Her father also became litigious, and he filed lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit, or claim after claim after claim with the federal government to get money, to get reparations for the damage that raiding Indian tribes had done to his various ranches. The legal records kept track of him. Legal records also kept track of Sophie's first husband, who committed a notorious crime. And when Sophie later in her life is forcibly moved to a reservation, the federal bureaucracy keeps track of her because they want to keep very careful track of who's going to get food rations and who's going to be allowed to get land when the reservations are broken up into private property. But I'm a truffle hunter, and I found some other weird things. I'm going to argue to you today that Sophie, the girl in the middle, actually exists because of the actions of the evil General Harney, second from the left, 13 years earlier. In 1855, 13 years before this photo was taken, Harney led a vindictive assault on a Lakota village at a place called Blue Water in present-day western Nebraska. His men murdered 86 Lakota people. They shot a young mother named Yellow Woman in the leg, and they took her baby and used it as target practice. Then Harney rounded up Yellow Woman and the other survivors of that assault and marched them 150 miles into Fort Laramie. In that Lakota camp that they destroyed, Harney and his men discovered that the Indians had ammunition that had been sold or traded to them by the French-Canadian trappers who controlled trade around this part of the world. So he ordered all of those traders, including a man named M.A. Mousseau, to come into Fort Laramie as well. So the wounded Yellow Woman, mourning her dead child, is marched into Fort Laramie, and M.A. Mousseau, the trader, is marched into Fort Laramie. They met, they married, they became Sophie's parents, and they remained married for over half a century. General Harney, in the weirdest of ways, was an accidental matchmaker. And I don't tell that story to minimize the horror of what Harney did, but I do want to say that we need to be open-minded when we think about the past. Sometimes horrific events can have unanticipated consequences, and if you're very, very lucky, perhaps they're good ones. Another unanticipated consequence unfolded just last month. It's a long story. If there's time, I can say more about it later. But I was present in early September at the Blue Water Massacre site as the Smithsonian Institution returned to the Lakota people the artifacts collected from that massacre field after 170 years. Descendants of Harney, descendants of the Lakota survivors of that massacre, worked together for nearly 20 years to make that happen. And somehow my story fell right into theirs. And at a moment of tremendous political strife in the United States, when the federal government is attacking the right of the Smithsonian and universities to narrate and tell certain stories about a very painful moment in the American past, this was an unbelievably moving and rare moment of reconciliation. It was an honor to be there. So the newly created Mousseau family, born of that blue water violence, lives on road ranches around Fort Laramie. And again, they fall victim to small-scale raids from hungry and angry native bands. And in a devastating attack in March of 1868, just 2 months before this picture was made, they lost everything, their home, their horses, everything they owned. And they came here to Fort Laramie for safety. When they got to the fort, they saw some of their horses. So whoever had stolen them was there participating in the treaty negotiations. They also saw 2 men they knew. Trust me, Sophie's parents would have recognized General Harney, who had looked just the same for the past 40 years. What did they tell their daughter about that man? Did she ever ask why her mother limps? Did she know she had a half-sibling who had been murdered by him? It's unknowable. Sophie's parents also recognized the man standing just to Sophie's right. He'd been wandering around the plains when he wasn't busy working with the Peace Commission, soliciting clients for his legal service because he was promising to get them reparations from the government. Total conflict of interest. He's there to negotiate how much money the tribes will get from the government, and then he's negotiating on the side to get a percentage of that for helping people sue the government, whatever. Conflicts of interest are not a new thing in American political history. The West was a really big world, and it was also a really small place. Gardner had photographed 3 of these men already back in his Washington, D.C. studio. Numerous Native leaders who showed up had met Harney in one war or one battle after another over a period of 30 years. Now, Sophie was born in 1860, so she is 8 years old here, and she might not look it, but I believe if you look carefully at her, her legs just look too long, right? They look too long. I think she's standing on a little box. And if you visually shorten her, if you imagine she's standing on a box maybe 8 inches high or something, her head is more the proportion that an 8-year-old child's head would have to a body. So what's her story? She grew up in road ranches around Fort Laramie. It is part of a mixed race world. Her father is white. He'd been born in Montreal. Her mother is Lakota. She married as a teenager when she was only about 14. And she had 5 children with her first husband, Posey Ryan, a white, Irish-born Civil War veteran. In late 1885, when her youngest child was still nursing, was about 2 months old, Posey fell in love with a white woman. He put Sophie in a wagon and had her taken away to the Pine Ridge Reservation. He effectively pulled off a parental kidnapping of his own children. She would not be able to see them. A Native woman had no rights in American territorial courts. She had no legal rights to regain access to her 5 children. And as Posey raised those children to think of themselves as white, she lost her cultural connection to them as well. I like to think, though, she didn't regret getting rid of Posey. A few years later, he walked into a restaurant, a hotel restaurant at Sunday lunch, and shot his second wife dead in the head, then shot his stepdaughter, and stood there with the smoking gun until he was arrested. In the way of Western American history storytelling, he became a kind of folk hero, but he also did go to prison. On the Pine Ridge Reservation, where some of her family now lived, Sophie found work as a laundress at the Oglala boarding school. And she was there when one of the most horrific acts of violence and a long litany of acts of violence against Native peoples occurred at nearby Wounded Knee in the closing days of 1890. She was likely in the schoolyard with the children at lunchtime when both the American soldiers and the Native survivors of that massacre came riding up over the mesa, down into Pine Ridge, where the government agency was. And it's one of those moments that you just stumble upon as a historian sometimes that just stun you. The American soldiers were shouting into the wind what happened. But the native survivors who were on horses were using Plains Sign Language. So the children who understood Plains Sign Language heard about the massacre before their white teachers could hear the words that would tell them what had happened. I would say that just this month, the US federal government upheld the decision to confer medals of honor on the soldiers who executed that massacre at Wounded Knee. So if the repatriation of the materials from Blue Water is an extraordinary gesture of reconciliation, we have not yet lost the taint of an older history. Sophie left her job in 1891 and in 1893 married a man named John Monroe. Like her, he had a Lakota mother and a white father. And he had spent several years traveling across the country as a juggler in a Wild West show. But he was also a skilled Lakota speaker who could speak archaic forms of the dialect, or archaic dialects of the language. And at the turn of the century, around 1900, when anthropologists began flocking to Pine Ridge to collect stories of the old pre-reservation days, he was the most sought after translator. So it's another one of those ironic moments. Sophie is living on Pine Ridge. She grew up in a mixed race world. She didn't grow up building teepees and striking camp and hunting buffalo with her family. She didn't know about the old ways. But now, at a moment when many people are confined to reservations and losing all of that traditional knowledge, she's acquiring it. Because her husband is coming home from work and saying, I spent all day talking to a woman who knows how to build teepees. This is how you do it. So it's ironic. She spent the last 50 years of her life on the Pine Ridge Reservation, living near the children of her second marriage. She had 8 from the second marriage, so that's 13 in all. And she did end up living near one son from her first marriage. John Ryan grew up white, but he was smart, and he figured out that he could deploy his blood relationship to his mother to get an allotment of land on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, which he did. And he also, I did not see this coming, became the first Lakota person to go to law school. Sophie died on one of the last warm days of fall in October 1936 in a simple dugout home. A descendant tells me that she died there as a bearskin flapped across the open door. So born into a dynamic mixed race world of traders and native peoples moving across the northern plains, she died on an Indian reservation in one of the very poorest counties in a depression-riven America. So let me just step back and ask, how does identifying the girl in the middle change the meaning of this picture? The first point is so obvious. Ordinary people, so long ignored by historians and record keepers, more concerned with political and military history, ordinary people have rich and complicated lives. Knowing this child is Sophie Mousseau allows us to think of what was once a simple record of a treaty negotiation. We can look at this now as a portal into a world of families. And we can also look at it as a portal into the extraordinary violence that marked American life during this time period. Peace Commission, it exists because there's a violent situation to solve. Sophie leads us into that world of domestic violence. Think of her first husband kidnapping the children and murdering his second wife. She leads us into a world of legal violence. She cannot go into an American court and assert her rights. And of course, she leads us into a world of political violence because the US government here is seeking to deny the tribes their own political autonomy and rights to self-determination. So everyone's story matters. The stories I've told today are new, but this photo that you've been looking at hasn't changed since it was made in 1868, although as someone noted, at one point it did crack. All that's changed is the questions that we ask of it. Just focus on the girl instead of the man, and you get somewhere new. Photographs exist in history. So this photograph has a particular meaning in the context of these treaty negotiations. But photographs also exist through history, and their meanings evolve as we approach them with our own changing needs and questions uppermost in mind. I really look forward to your questions, but let me just close with one entreaty. Please go home, pull out that shoebox, and label your family photographs. Thank you so much.